You know that moment when your body starts erasing you and nobody notices? When you lose 37 pounds and the man you've devoted your life to tells you that you look lighter, like it's a compliment. I stood in Edward's study last Tuesday holding files I could barely lift, watching my hands shake so badly the papers rustled. 23 years of keeping his immortal world running. 23 years of being the steady one, the constant, the woman who made eternity feel manageable for a vampire king who couldn't remember what century he was living in without me. And when the headaches came, when my body started rejecting food like it had declared war on my own survival, I smiled. Put on another cardigan to hide the way my clothes hung off bones that were becoming too sharp, too visible. Because asking for help felt like admitting I'd failed at the one thing I was supposed to be, indispensable. If you've ever made yourself small enough to disappear while still being essential, stay. There are women who know what it means to die quietly, so no one has to be inconvenienced by your suffering. If you're one of them, this story knows you. You just have to let yourself stay. The headache started in February. Not the normal kind, the kind you take 2 aspirin for and forget about by lunch. These felt like something was breaking apart inside my skull. Like my brain was trying to crack through bone and escape the confines of my body. I went to the clinic on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of cold Illinois day where the wind off Lake Michigan cuts through your coat and settles into your bones. Dr. Okonkwo ran tests, blood panels, neurological exams, an MRI that cost more than I made in a month, all of it covered by Edward's comprehensive medical plan for essential staff. Essential. That word sat in my chest like a stone. Everything looks normal, Ms. Olson, she said, her dark eyes kind but confused. Blood pressure's a little low, but nothing concerning. Are you under stress? I almost laughed. Stress. As if stress was something separate from my existence, something I could identify and manage rather than the baseline state of keeping a 3-century-old vampire functioning in the modern world. I manage a demanding household, I told her. Household. Like Edward's territory spanning half the Midwest was just a particularly complicated domestic situation. She prescribed rest, hydration, maybe some yoga. I went back to work that same afternoon because Edward had a meeting with the Chicago syndicate at 7 and someone needed to prepare the briefs, anticipate the territorial disputes, know which historical grudges were going to resurface, and how to redirect the conversation before anyone decided a modern alliance wasn't worth maintaining. That night, I stood in his study at midnight. I was always in his study at midnight, while he reviewed documents I'd prepared. He didn't look up when I set the revised contracts on his desk. Just kept reading, his pale fingers elegant against the paper, every movement containing the kind of grace you only develop after centuries of existence. The Kellerman Clause, he said absently. Did you include the modification we discussed? Page 17, paragraph 4. Cross-referenced with the 1847 treaty language you preferred.
Good. Still not looking at me.
Wanda, you're invaluable. Invaluable. Essential. Indispensable. All words that meant, I see what you do, not who you are. The headache split behind my left eye like lightning. I pressed my fingers to my temple, willing the pain to recede, to be manageable, to not interrupt this moment where Edward needed me to be the steady thing in his chaotic world. Are you unwell? He glanced up finally, his hazel eyes, the ones that shifted toward gold when he was agitated or hungry, scanning my face with what might have been concern if I hadn't learned to recognize it as inconvenience. Just tired, I lied. The first of many lies. It's late. Then rest. Tomorrow's going to be demanding. The Seattle delegation arrives at noon, and they're already positioned to object to our northern expansion. I nodded, left his study, walked down the hallway of his Lincoln Park estate, all restored Victorian elegance and modern security, the kind of place that announced old money and older power, to my quarters on the 3rd floor.
I didn't rest.
I spent 3 hours researching the Seattle delegation's history, their alliances, the personal grievances going back 90 years that nobody had bothered to document, but everyone remembered. By the time I finished, dawn was breaking pink and cold over the city, and the headache had evolved into something that made my vision blur at the edges. I took 4 aspirin. Drank water I didn't want. Lay down for an hour that felt like 5 minutes. At 8 a.m., I was back in Edward's study with coffee brewed exactly how he preferred it. Dark enough to offend human sensibilities, but not so bitter it interfered with the subtle notes he claimed to taste after 300 years of drinking it, and a briefing packet that would make the Seattle meeting merely difficult instead of catastrophic. He smiled when he saw me. The kind of smile that made you understand why mortals had spent centuries throwing themselves at vampire nobility, hoping proximity to forever might grant them significance. "What would I do without you?" he said. It was meant as affection. I heard it as prophecy. Because 3 weeks later, I stopped being able to eat breakfast. Then lunch. Then anything at all. And Edward never noticed I was disappearing. The first time my body rejected food, I was standing in Edward's kitchen at 6 in the morning trying to force down half a piece of toast. It came back up before I'd even left the room. I cleaned the sink with the kind of methodical precision I'd learned from 2 decades of managing crisis. Bleach, hot water, evidence erased. Then I stood there with my hands braced against the counter, watching the steam rise, and told myself it was nothing. Stress. The headaches. My body's protest against too many late nights and not enough sleep. The second time I was in my bathroom. The third, I didn't make it to a bathroom at all. By April, I'd stopped trying to eat solid food. Switched to broths, protein shakes, anything that might slip past whatever revolt my stomach had staged against my survival. But my body had made a decision I hadn't been consulted about. Everything came back up. Liquid, solid, the expensive nutritional supplements Dr. Okonkwo prescribed when I went back and told her, in carefully casual terms, that I was having digestive issues. "We should run more tests," she said, her brow furrowed in that way doctors get when the obvious answers aren't presenting themselves. This level of persistent nausea could indicate. "I'll schedule something," I interrupted, already calculating Edward's calendar in my head. The Minneapolis merger. The territorial review with the Texas clans. The annual gathering in May where every vampire with a claim to Midwest territory would converge on Chicago and expect Edward to perform centuries of dominance with perfect, careless grace. I didn't schedule anything. Instead, I bought cardigans. Soft ones in neutral colors that hung loose enough to hide the way my clothes had started gaping at the waist, at the shoulders, everywhere fabric was supposed to meet body, but now just draped over increasingly prominent bone. I'd lost 15 pounds by mid-April, 22 by early May. Nobody noticed. Or maybe that's not fair. Maybe they noticed the way you notice someone got a haircut or changed their usual coffee order, peripheral awareness that doesn't quite register as important enough to comment on. Edward noticed on a Tuesday morning in May. I was in his study. Always his study. That room had become more familiar to me than my own bedroom, laying out documents for the gathering. He looked up from his phone, glanced at me with that casual attention he deployed when he wasn't really focusing, and smiled. "You look lighter, Wanda. It suits you." For words. Delivered with the thoughtless kindness of someone who thinks they're giving a compliment. I felt something inside me crack. Not break. Breaking would have been too clean, too final. This was the kind of crack that spiderwebs through glass, the kind that means the whole structure is compromised but still holding, still functional, still performing its purpose even as it's failing from the inside out. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady in the way I'd trained it to be steady through every crisis, every emergency, every moment when showing what I actually felt would have been inconvenient for the people who needed me to be fine. He went back to his phone. The moment passed. That night, I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Hollow-cheeked. Shadows under eyes that looked too large for my face. Collarbones sharp enough to cast shadows in the bathroom light. I looked like I was dying. I looked exactly like what I was. The makeup helped. Concealer for the bruised dark circles. Blush to create the illusion of health where health no longer existed. Lipstick because pale lips apparently signal surrender, and I wasn't ready to surrender yet. I still had work to do. That's what I told myself as I began organizing Edward's world with the kind of obsessive precision that would have alarmed me if I'd had enough distance to recognize it for what it was. I wasn't organizing anymore. I was preparing. I created spreadsheets, documented every recurring meeting, every alliance that required maintenance, every historical grudge that needed managing. I wrote instructions for tasks I'd been handling for so long they'd become instinct. How Edward preferred his correspondence formatted, which vampires required personal phone calls versus emails, the specific way he liked his evening report structured, so he could absorb information without feeling overwhelmed by the weight of running a territory that spanned 6 states. I labeled files, color-coded calendars, built redundancy into every system because some part of me understood what the rest of me refused to acknowledge. I was making myself replaceable. Not because I wanted to leave, but because leaving was starting to feel less like choice and more like inevitability, and I couldn't bear the thought of Edward's world collapsing because I hadn't prepared him for my absence. The gathering came. 3 days of territorial negotiations, alliance renewals, carefully choreographed displays of power where every vampire in the Midwest came to pay respect to Edward and assess whether he still had the strength to hold what he'd claimed. I managed it all from behind the scenes. Scheduled meetings, mediated disputes before they reached Edward, made sure he looked effortless while I cataloged every detail, every nuance, every moment that required intervention. On the final night, he found me in the kitchen at 2 a.m, sitting in the dark because the overhead lights made my headache worse, and I couldn't keep pretending I didn't have one. "You were brilliant," he said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. Appreciation, maybe even affection. "I don't know how you do it, Wanda. You make the impossible look easy." I wanted to scream, wanted to grab his shoulders and make him really look at what was happening to me. Wanted to tell him that I'd lost 27 pounds in 3 months, that I couldn't remember the last time I'd kept down a meal, that there were mornings I woke up and didn't know if I had the strength to get out of bed, but I did it anyway because he needed me. Instead, I smiled. That's my job. He squeezed my shoulder, brief, almost paternal, and left. I sat in the dark for another hour, hands trembling in my lap, and made a decision I'd been avoiding for weeks. I needed to ask for time. Just a week. Maybe 2. Long enough to see doctors who might actually have answers, long enough to figure out what my body was doing and why, long enough to stop pretending I could manage this alone. The thought of asking felt like failure. Like admitting I wasn't strong enough, capable enough, essential enough to handle whatever this was and my responsibilities and Edward's needs all at the same time. But the alternative was collapsing in the middle of his study one day, and that felt like a worse betrayal. So I decided. Tomorrow I would ask. Tomorrow I would finally admit I needed help. I just didn't know yet that tomorrow would be too late to matter. I practiced the words for 3 days before I could say them out loud. "Edward, I need a week." 6 words. Simple.
Direct.
The kind of request any employee makes without drama, without the weight I'd attached to it, like asking for time was the same as asking to be seen as human instead of infrastructure. I found him in his study on a Thursday morning. Of course his study. Where else would this happen? Reviewing contracts for a property acquisition in Gary. He was relaxed. One of those rare moments when the weight of 3 centuries didn't sit quite so heavily on his shoulders, when he looked almost like the man he might have been if he'd stayed mortal, if time had touched him the way it was destroying me. "Edward." He didn't look up. His attention stayed on the document, his elegant fingers tracing a line of text that probably referenced some treaty from 1923 that everyone had forgotten except him. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my thighs, felt the sharp jut of bone where there used to be muscle, fat, the normal padding of a body that wasn't eating itself alive. "I need to request a week's leave of absence." That got his attention. His eyes lifted, hazel shifting toward gold, that small tell that meant I'd surprised him, and he set down the contract with deliberate care. "Is everything all right?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of everything I wasn't saying spreading out between us. I could have told him the truth then. Could have said, "No, nothing is all right. I'm dying and I don't know why, and I'm terrified and I need you to notice that I'm disappearing." Instead, I smiled. The same smile I'd perfected over 23 years. Reassuring.
Confident.
The smile that said nothing is wrong that I can't handle. Just some personal matters I need to attend to. Medical appointments. Nothing serious. He relaxed immediately,
Visibly.
like my reassurance was permission to stop worrying, to return his attention to the things that actually demanded it. Of course. When do you need to leave? Tomorrow, if possible. I've prepared everything. I gestured to the tablet I'd brought, the one containing documentation so thorough it felt like writing my own replacement manual. All your meetings are scheduled. The Denver situation has contingency plans. I've briefed Simone on the daily protocols, and everything else is in the shared drive with instructions detailed enough that… Wanda. He cut me off, but gently, almost amused. I trust you. Take the time you need. 2 weeks if you want it. 2 weeks. He said it so easily, like time was something he could just give away because he had an infinite supply of it and couldn't quite remember that the rest of us were on a clock that kept running whether we were ready or not. 1 week should be sufficient, I said, because asking for more felt greedy. Felt like admitting this was worse than I was pretending it was.
Fine.
He paused, and for a moment I thought he might say something real. Something that acknowledged the 2 decades I'd given him, the way I'd structured my entire life around keeping his world functional. Make sure your phone is on, just in case something urgent comes up. Of course. Even my leave came with conditions. With the expectation that I'd still be available, still be the safety net, still be the thing that caught him when the world got too complicated. Of course, I said. He was already looking back at his contracts. The conversation was over. I'd been granted permission to fall apart, as long as I did it efficiently and didn't inconvenience him too much in the process. I left the next morning before dawn. Drove myself to O'Hare, left my car in long-term parking, and caught a flight to San Francisco. From there, a rental car to Santa Clara, to the medical facility Dr. Okonkwo had recommended when I'd finally called her back and admitted, in a voice that barely stayed steady, that the digestive issues weren't resolving themselves. St. Catherine's has an excellent diagnostic program, she'd said, her concern bleeding through professional distance. Wanda, how much weight have you lost? I'm handling it, I'd told her. Even then, even when my body was staging a full revolt, still pretending I had everything under control. St. Catherine's was small, private. The kind of place that specialized in the cases other hospitals couldn't figure out, the medical mysteries that required time and attention, and the kind of comprehensive testing that insurance companies fought against. I checked myself in on a Friday afternoon. Gave them Edward's insurance information. His corporate policy covered anything, everything, because he took care of his people even if he never quite saw them as people. The intake nurse looked at me with the kind of professional concern that probably worked on most patients, but just made me want to apologize for taking up space. You're severely underweight, she said, not unkindly. When did you last eat a full meal? I couldn't remember.
Weeks?
Months? Time had gone strange, measured in pounds lost instead of days passing. They admitted me immediately. Started 4 fluids, because I was dehydrated in ways I hadn't even registered. Ran blood panels. Scheduled scans. Asked questions I didn't have answers for. The week passed in a blur of white walls and beeping machines and doctors who spoke in careful tones about concerning results and additional testing and the need for patience while they figured out what was wrong. Edward didn't call. Not on day 1 when they first told me my liver enzymes were elevated. Not on day 3 when the scans showed inflammation they couldn't explain. Not on day 5 when Dr. Reyes sat beside my hospital bed and said the words multi-system organ involvement like they were supposed to mean something to me besides. This is worse than you thought. I told myself he was busy, that he trusted me to handle my own medical situation the way I handled everything else. That his silence didn't mean he didn't care, just that he cared in ways that didn't include checking on the people who made his life possible. On day 7, the day I was supposed to return, I still couldn't keep down solid food. The 4 was the only thing keeping me hydrated. Dr. Reyes was talking about specialists in San Diego, about experimental treatments, about the possibility that what I had might be autoimmune, might be degenerative, might be something they'd never seen before. I needed to tell Edward the first wasn't coming back yet. Needed to extend my leave, admit this wasn't handled, wasn't fine. Wasn't something I could fix with a week and some medical appointments. I picked up my phone. Stared at his number.
Put it down again.
Because somewhere in the space between leaving and lying in this hospital bed watching my body fail, I'd realized something that hurt worse than the physical pain. Edward hadn't called because he hadn't needed to. My absence hadn't mattered enough to notice. And that truth, that I could disappear from his life for 7 days and not leave enough of a gap to make him wonder where I'd gone, was the thing that finally broke something in me that all the weight loss and vomiting and headaches hadn't managed to touch. I was dying, and the man I'd spent 23 years protecting didn't even know I was gone. Edward noticed I was gone on day 9. Not because he missed me. Not because my absence created a void in his life that felt like something essential had been removed. He noticed because the Toronto delegation arrived for their scheduled meeting and nobody had prepared the historical brief. Because his afternoon calls weren't queued in the order he preferred. Because small things started falling through cracks I'd spent 2 decades making sure didn't exist. I know this because Simone called me on day 10. Wanda. Her voice was tight with something between panic and relief. Where are you? Edward's been asking. Things are falling apart here. The contracts for the Milwaukee property weren't filed. The Seattle Alliance renewal is next week and nobody can find the documentation. He keeps asking for you, and I don't know what to tell him because you said a week and it's been. I'm in California, I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. Like it was coming from somewhere outside my body, which maybe it was. Maybe I'd already started separating from this failing flesh, this betraying skeleton wrapped in skin that had gone paper thin. Tell him I need more time. How much more time? I looked at the 4-line threading into my arm. At Dr. Reyes's notes on the whiteboard. Consult GI specialist. Discuss feeding tube options. Family meeting. Family. I'd written none on the intake form. 23 years of my life given to Edward's family, his territory, his people, his endless network of alliances and obligations, and when it came time to list my own, the line stayed blank. I don't know, I told Simone. I'll call him. I didn't call him, but on day 11 he called me. My phone rang at 9:47 p.m. His name on the screen. I stared at it through 2 rings, 3, feeling something that might have been hope if hope didn't hurt so much. Maybe he'd realized. Maybe the distance had given him clarity. Maybe he was calling to ask if I was okay, if I needed anything, if I was coming back because he missed me and not just because his world was inconvenient without me. I answered on the 4th ring. Wanda. Not a question. A statement. Relief and irritation mixed together. Where are you? Santa Clara. I told you medical appointments. For 11 days? Now there was concern, but it was the wrong kind. Practical concern. The concern of someone realizing their most essential tool might be broken beyond quick repair. What's wrong? Everything I wanted to say. I'm dying and you never noticed I was sick. I've lost 39 pounds, and you told me it suited me. I can't eat, can't sleep, can't remember what it feels like to exist in a body that isn't fighting against itself. They're running tests, I said instead. It's taking longer than expected. What kind of tests? Is it serious? The machines around me beeped their steady rhythm. 4 drip. Heart monitor. The feeding tube they'd placed yesterday because my body had finally given up even the pretense of accepting nutrition. They're not sure yet, I said, which was true. Dr. Reyes had theories: autoimmune disorder, paraneoplastic syndrome, something rare enough that she was consulting with specialists across the country, but nothing definitive. Nothing that came with a cure or even a timeline. I need you back, Wanda. His voice carried that edge it got when he was trying not to sound desperate. This transition isn't working. Simone means well, but she doesn't know the systems like you do. She doesn't anticipate. I've got the council review in 3 days, and the documentation isn't. I organized everything. I heard my voice go flat. Professional. The same tone I used when I was too exhausted to feel anything, but still had to function. It's all in the shared drive. Color-coded by urgency. The council review materials are in the folder marked June Critical, with subfolder navigation. I don't want the folders, Wanda. I want you. For words that might have meant something if they weren't immediately followed by. When can you come home? Home. He called it home like I lived there, like his estate was where I belonged instead of just where I worked. Like the difference between those things had ever mattered to him. I don't know, I said, and my voice finally cracked. Edward, I don't know if I... The door to my room opened. Dr. Reyes, her dark eyes taking in the phone pressed to my ear, the tears I'd been holding back finally spilling over. I have to go, I said quickly. I'll update you when I know more. I ended the call before he could respond. Dr. Reyes sat in the chair beside my bed, the one that was meant for visitors I didn't have, and handed me a tissue with a kind of gentle competence that made me cry harder. Was that family? She asked. My employer. Something shifted in her expression. Not judgment. Something sadder. Wanda, we need to talk about your test results. And we need to discuss who we should contact when we need to make care decisions.
When.
The space between those words was where my future used to be.
She told me then.
Told me about the organ damage, the malnutrition that had progressed beyond simple reversal, the way my body had been cannibalizing itself for months while I smiled and organized Edward's files and pretended everything was manageable. We're looking at weeks, she said quietly. Maybe a month or two with aggressive intervention. I'm so sorry. I didn't cry. I'd run out of tears somewhere between irreversible and palliative care options. I just nodded. Asked her to write everything down because even dying, some part of me needed documentation, needed to organize the chaos into something I could understand and file appropriately. She left. I sat in the dark with machines breathing for me, feeding me, keeping me tethered to a body that had already started letting go. My phone rang again at 11:33 p.m. Edward's name. Again. I didn't answer. But at 2:47 a.m., when I was drifting in that space between sleep and sedation, I heard voices in the hallway. Dr. Reyes's professional calm. And then another voice, male, carrying the kind of authority that came from centuries of people doing what he wanted. I don't care what your visiting hours are. She works for me. I need to see her. The door opened. Edward walked in, still dressed in the suit he probably wore to whatever meeting ran late, his hair slightly disheveled like he'd been running his hands through it. He looked worried, frustrated, inconvenienced by the crisis I'd become. Then he saw me. Actually saw me. And I watched everything in his face change. The hospital gown hanging off shoulders that were mostly bone. The 4 lines and monitors. The feeding tube. My face, which had gone from full to gaunt to something that probably looked like a preview of my own corpse. He went completely still. That supernatural stillness that wasn't quite human, that made him look like a statue, like something carved from marble that had forgotten how to breathe. Wanda. My name came out broken. Disbelieving. What? You should have called first, I said, and even medicated, even dying, I still had enough pride left to try for dignity. Visiting hours start at 8. He moved to my bedside like he was in a dream, reached for my hand, the one without the 4, and stopped just short of touching, like he was afraid I might shatter. How long? His voice was barely a whisper. How long have you been like this? Like this. Like dying was a condition I'd suddenly developed instead of a process I'd been living through for months while he told me I looked lighter. Since February, I said. The headaches. Then everything else. I try to tell you I needed time. You said medical appointments. You said it wasn't serious. I said they were running tests. You didn't ask what kind. The machines beeped. The 4 dripped. Edward stood beside my bed looking at me like he was seeing a stranger, and maybe he was. Maybe the Wanda he'd known, efficient, capable, always fine, had never really existed outside his need for her. I'm calling specialists, he said, and there it was. The solution. The fix. The best doctors. Whatever this is, money isn't an object, Wanda. We'll fly you to Switzerland. To anywhere. Edward. I stopped him with his name, soft but final. It's too late.
No.
Immediate.
Certain.
No, you don't understand. I have resources. Connections. There are treatments. There are no treatments for what I have. Dr. Reyes has been consulting with everyone. The damage is done. I watched him process this. Watched a man who'd lived 3 centuries, who'd survived wars and plagues and every kind of death civilization could invent, try to comprehend that the woman who'd made his immortal life bearable was mortal after all. And he'd never noticed until it was too late to matter. Edward brought them all. Specialists from Johns Hopkins, a diagnostic team from Mayo Clinic, a researcher from Geneva who'd published papers on rare autoimmune disorders that existed in medical journals most doctors never read. He flew them in on private jets, put them up in 5-star hotels, paid consultation fees that could have funded entire hospital wings. They came with their credentials and their confidence and their sophisticated equipment. They reviewed my charts, ordered new tests, conferred in hushed voices outside my room using words like unprecedented and remarkable progression and unfortunate. Dr. Reyes coordinated with them all, her professional courtesy barely masking what I could see in her eyes every time another specialist arrived. This won't change anything. But Edward needed to try. Needed to believe that money and connections and 3 centuries of accumulated power could solve a problem as simple as a mortal woman's body deciding to stop. I watched him from my hospital bed, drifting in and out on medication that made time go soft and strange. Watched him pace the hallway outside my room, phone pressed to his ear, making calls in that voice he used when he was commanding armies or territories or the trajectory of other people's lives. He was trying to save me the way he solved everything else. With force. With resources. With the absolute conviction that the world bent to his will if he just applied enough pressure. On day 3 of his intervention, the Geneva specialist, Dr. Beaumont, her French accent precise as surgery, sat beside my bed with Edward standing behind her like a sentinel. "Ms. Olson," she said, and her kindness felt practiced. Professional. The kindness of someone who delivered terrible news so many times she'd perfected the tone. "I've reviewed all your results. Consulted with my colleagues. The damage to your organs, your liver, kidneys, digestive system, it's extensive. Advanced. The malnutrition created a cascade effect that we simply cannot reverse." "There has to be something," Edward said, not letting her finish. "Experimental treatments. Clinical trials. I don't care about FDA approval or—" "Mr. Stark." Dr. Beaumont turned to face him, and there was steel under her compassion. "Even if we had a miracle treatment, her body is too compromised to survive it. The interventions themselves would likely kill her faster than the disease. I'm sorry. Truly. But we're looking at palliative care now. Comfort. The quality of remaining time." "How much time?" His voice had gone quiet. "Dangerous. Weeks. Perhaps a month with aggressive supportive care." The machines beeped their steady rhythm. My heart monitor spiked and settled. I watched Edward's face go through emotions he probably hadn't felt in centuries. Denial, rage, desperation, grief, all flickering across his features too fast to land on any single one. "No," he said. "Simple. Final. I don't accept that." Dr. Beaumont stood, gathered her tablet and her reports and her carefully documented futility. "I wish acceptance were required, Mr. Stark. I'll send my full recommendations to Dr. Reyes. Ms. Olson, it's been an honor." She left. Edward stayed, standing at the foot of my bed like if he just remained there long enough, refused to move, refused to accept, somehow reality would reshape itself around his will. "Edward." My voice came out thin, tired. The medication made everything feel distant, like I was speaking from the bottom of a well. "You should go home. Back to Illinois. You have the council review." Fuck the council review. I'd never heard him curse before. Not in 23 years. He was always controlled, always composed, always the vampire king who'd mastered every aspect of himself, including language. "I'm not leaving," he said, moving to the chair beside my bed. The visitor's chair that had sat empty for days until he arrived. "I'm not going anywhere. There's nothing you can do here. Then I'll do nothing here." He reached for my hand, actually took it this time, his fingers cool against my skin. I should have, Wanda, I should have seen this. Should have noticed. You were disappearing right in front of me, and I was so focused on territories and alliances and... I hid it, I interrupted. I got good at hiding it. That's not your fault. Yes, it is. His grip tightened, careful not to hurt, but desperate enough that I felt it through the medication haze. You hid it because you thought I couldn't handle the truth. Because in 23 years, I never once made you feel like your well-being mattered more than your productivity. I turned you into a tool and wondered why you never asked for help when the machinery started breaking down. He was right. God, he was right. But hearing him say it now, when it was too late to change anything, just made the truth hurt worse. You didn't turn me into anything, I said, needing him to understand this even if it was the last thing I made clear. I chose this. Chose to make myself indispensable. Chose to find my value in being what you needed instead of being who I was. That's not on you. That's on me. On every choice I made to put you first and myself somewhere around 47th. The monitors beeped. The 4 dripped. Outside my window, Santa Clara went about its evening routine, people living their lives while mine counted down in weeks. I don't want you to die, Edward said, and his voice broke on the last word. Actually broke. I know that's selfish. I know I don't have the right to ask you to stay when I never properly valued you being here in the first place. But Wanda, I can't. The thought of existing without you. You'll be fine. I squeezed his hand, or tried to. My strength was mostly gone. You survived 3 centuries before me. You'll survive after. I don't want to survive. He stopped. Looked at me with eyes that had shifted fully to gold, that color they went when he was feeling things he didn't have words for. I want to go back. Fix this. Make different choices. Notice you.
See you.
Ask you how you were doing, and actually wait for an honest answer. I wouldn't have given you one, I admitted. I would have smiled and said I was fine, because that's what I did. What I always did. I taught you not to ask, Edward. I trained you to believe I was invincible. A nurse came in to check my vitals, adjust my medication. Edward watched her work with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail, like if he just paid enough attention now he could make up for all the months of not seeing. When she left, he pulled the chair closer. Settled and like he meant it about not leaving. Tell me, he said. Tell me about when it started. About every moment I missed. I want to know. I need to know. So I told him. About the headaches in February. The first time I couldn't keep down food. The weight loss he'd complimented. The cardigans. The makeup. The obsessive organizing because some part of me knew I was preparing his world to function without me. I told him about standing in his kitchen at 2 a.m. trying to force down nutrition shakes that came back up minutes later. About the morning I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the skeletal woman staring back. About asking for a week and feeling like I was admitting failure. He listened. Didn't interrupt. Didn't try to defend himself or explain. Just sat there holding my hand and letting me lay out the evidence of my own erasure. When I finished, exhausted from the most honest conversation we'd ever had, he was crying. Actually crying. Tears tracking down his face in a way that probably hadn't happened since he was human. I'm sorry, I whispered, because even now, even dying, my instinct was to comfort him. I'm sorry I'm putting you through this. I know it's inconvenient. I know you didn't sign up for. Stop. He pressed my hand to his face, his tears wet against my palm. Stop apologizing. Stop making yourself small. Stop acting like your dying is somehow an imposition on my life, when it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me in 300 years. The machines beeped faster. My heart monitor spiking because even failing, even medicated, my body still responded to being seen, to being valued, to hearing, finally, that I mattered. I love you, Edward said, and the words landed like stones in still water. Not as an employee, not as my essential person, as you, as Wanda, as the woman who made eternity bearable, and I was too blind to tell her while she was still here to hear it. I wanted to say it back. Wanted to tell him that I'd loved him for years, decades, that loving him had been the easiest and hardest thing I'd ever done. But the medication was pulling me under, and my last conscious thought before sleep took me was that some confessions come too late to change anything. They just let you know what you're losing. And that knowing, that terrible, beautiful knowing, is its own kind of goodbye. I died slowly, which gave us time. Not enough time. There's never enough time when you're trying to fit 23 years of unspoken things into 3 weeks. But time enough for the conversations we should have been having all along. The ones I'd been too afraid to start, and he'd been too blind to notice we needed. Edward stayed. Checked into a hotel 2 blocks from St. Catherine's, but spent every waking hour in my room. He learned the rotation of nurses, memorized the medication schedule, asked Dr. Reyes questions with the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for territorial negotiations. He was trying to understand what he'd missed. Trying to see me. It was 3 weeks too late, but I let him try anyway. On day 4 of his vigil, when the morphine made everything soft around the edges, he asked me about my life before him. About the woman I'd been at 25 when I answered his job posting for a personal assistant, before I'd learned to measure my worth in his needs. I told him about my mother, who died when I was 19. About the brief marriage in my 30s that ended when my husband decided he wanted a wife who was present instead of essential to someone else's empire. About the dreams I'd had once, grad school, maybe, or traveling, or just existing in a body that belonged to me instead of being leased out to other people's purposes. "Why did you stay?" he asked, his hand wrapped around mine like he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. 23 years, Wanda. You could have left any time. Built a different life. Why did you stay? I thought about lying. About giving him an answer that was easier, kinder, less complicated than the truth. But I was dying, and I'd spent enough of my life making things comfortable for other people. Because I loved you, I said simply. Not the way you love employer. The way you love family. The way you love the thing that gives your life structure and meaning even when the structure costs everything you are. You needed me, and being needed felt like being seen. I didn't understand until too late that they weren't the same thing. His face did something complicated. Grief and recognition, and the particular pain of understanding how badly you failed someone who deserved better. I did see you, he said, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. You are essential, indispensable, invaluable. I smiled, or tried to. My face didn't work quite right anymore. I know all the words, Edward. But those are words for what I did, not who I was. And the difference between those things, that's where I disappeared.
He was quiet for a long time.
Outside my window, evening settled over Santa Clara, the sky going purple and gold. Beautiful. Indifferent to the small tragedy happening in room 347. You were family, he finally said. The only family that mattered. The only person in 3 centuries who knew me, really knew me, and stayed anyway. I just never told you that. Never made you feel like you were more than staff, because if I did, if I admitted how much you meant, then I'd have to acknowledge how terrifying it was to need someone. To depend on a mortal woman's presence for my own stability. So you kept me at a distance, I said, understanding clicking into place even through the medication haze. Close enough to be useful. Far enough to be safe. Yes. The word came out broken. And I was so good at it that I convinced myself the distance was real. That you were just my assistant. That I could replace you if I needed to. That your well-being was your own responsibility and not something I should have been protecting the way you protected me for 23 years. The machines beeped their steady countdown. My body was shutting down in stages, organs failing in the order Dr. Reyes had predicted with her careful, compassionate accuracy. Kidneys first, then liver. My heart would be last, stubbornly pumping even when there was nothing left to sustain. I forgive you, I whispered, because he needed to hear it and I needed to say it before the morphine took me somewhere words didn't reach. For not seeing. For not asking. For all of it. I forgive you, Edward. He pressed his forehead to our joined hands and wept like something in him was breaking that had been held together by force and denial for too long. We had good days after that. Strange as it sounds, those last weeks held moments of grace. Edward read to me when the pain made it hard to focus, books I'd mentioned once, years ago, that he remembered. He told me stories about his human life, the man he'd been before immortality complicated everything. We talked about small things, important things, all the things we'd never had time for when I was busy being indispensable. On my last lucid day, I knew it was the last because my body knew, even if my mind didn't want to acknowledge it. I asked him what he'd do after. After? He looked at me like the word didn't make sense. After I'm gone, you'll still have territories, alliances, centuries ahead of you. What will you do with them? His hand tightened on mine. I don't know. Exist, I suppose. Try to honor what you taught me. Try to see people instead of just their function. Try to be less of a fool. You weren't a fool. You were just immortal. Sometimes that makes it hard to remember that not everything lasts forever. You should have lasted forever, he said fiercely. You deserved forever. But forever isn't given to mortal women who love immortal men. It's just one of those truths you learn when you're old enough to understand that love doesn't change the fundamental mathematics of existence. I died on a Thursday morning at 6:23 a.m. Edward was holding my hand, had been holding it for 3 hours since the nurses called him at 3 a.m. and said he should come, that the time was close. Dr. Reyes was there too, checking monitors with quiet efficiency, making sure I wasn't in pain, making sure my last moments were as gentle as medicine could make them. The sun was just starting to rise over Santa Clara. Pink light filtering through the window, catching dust motes and making them glow like they meant something. Like the world was beautiful even when you were leaving it. I looked at Edward one last time. Tried to memorize his face. The face I'd seen across desks and dinner tables and crisis moments for 23 years. The face I'd loved without ever saying it until it was too late to matter. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely there. For staying. For seeing me. For this. Wanda, his voice broke. I'm not ready. I'm not. But my body had made a decision my heart couldn't argue with. The monitors went from beeping to a single sustained tone. Dr. Reyes moved forward with professional grace. And I felt myself letting go, not fighting anymore, not trying to stay, just surrendering to the simple truth that sometimes love isn't enough to keep you here. The last thing I heard was Edward saying my name. Not his assistant. Not his essential person. Just Wanda. Finally, completely, devastatingly seen. There are women who spend their lives learning that being needed isn't the same as being loved. That essential isn't the same as valued. That you can disappear while standing right in front of someone if they've decided your function matters more than your existence. If this story felt like yours, if you recognized yourself in my careful invisibility or Edward's terrible blindness, you're not alone.
There are more stories like this.
Stories about women who loved too well and men who understood too late. Stories about the cost of devotion and the weight of being seen only after you're gone. These stories exist in the spaces between what we say and what we mean, between who we are and who we perform being. And if you need them, if you need to hear that other women have walked this path and survived, or didn't survive but mattered anyway, they're here. You just have to stay long enough to find them. Edward buried me in Santa Clara. Not because I had ties to California, but because I died there and he couldn't bear the thought of moving me one more time, making me travel one more mile for someone else's convenience. He stood at the graveside alone. He'd forbidden anyone from his world to attend, said this grief was his to carry, and understood, too late, what it meant to lose the person who'd made his immortal life feel human. Some losses don't heal. They just teach you what you should have known when the person was still alive to hear it. That's what Edward learned, standing in a California cemetery at sunset, mourning a woman he'd loved and lost without ever telling her she was more than essential. She was everything. And he'd only figured it out when everything was gone.